After the U.S. Supreme Court's decision to allow same-sex marriage, a debate's now been triggered over polygamy. Could the marrying of multiple partners be next? Who's against polygamy? And what are the legal challenges? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Derine Abougaida. Gay couples celebrated across the United States a couple of weeks ago. That's when the U.S. Supreme Court legalized same-sex marriage. So after the celebrations died down, what's next? Well, the answer may be the legalization of polygamy, that the ruling on same-sex marriage means the institution can be redefined to allow group marriages. However, in many cases, the same people who fought for marriage equality are campaigning against multi-marriage. Well, Supreme Court judges voted 5-4 for marriage equality. Same-sex couples across the United States can now get married. Any state-level bans are now void. Facebook profile pictures changed, pride parades were quickly planned, and the White House sported new colors of the rainbow. President Barack Obama had this to say.
This ruling will strengthen all of our communities by offering to all loving same-sex couples the dignity of marriage across this great land.
And that sentiment is being echoed by many activists across the U.S.
This decision is a long time coming, and I'm really glad that everyone can finally love who they want to love.
I want to live in a world where the rights for all people, of all colors, of all creeds, of all religions, of all nationalities, and of all gender identities and sexual orientation. So this is just amazing.
We want to make sure that we continue to fight because our community needs not just marriage, but also employment protections, and we also need housing protections and a whole host of other issues that we're combating today.
Well, that same level of support is not being extended to advocates for group marriage. Recent attempts to overturn the legal ban on polygamy have failed. That said, a recent Gallup poll shows that the movement has been gaining popularity over the last decade, from 5% in 2006 to 16% today. Some say the TV show Sister Wives, which was first broadcast 4 years ago, is helping normalize the idea of polygamy to the average American. Let's bring in our guests to discuss this. In Indianapolis in the United States, we have FREDDIE DEBOER. He's author of It's Time to Legalize Polygamy. Over in Syracuse, Stephen Macedo is the author of Just Married Same-Sex Couples, Monogamy and the Future of Marriage. Over in New York, Andy Eisenson. He's an associate attorney at the firm Diana Adams Law and Mediation. Thanks very much for being with us. FREDDIE, you write, it's time to legalize polygamy. You then go on to say the marriage equality movement has been curiously hostile to polygamy and for a particularly unsatisfying reason, short-term political need. Can you explain this?
Sure. For a long time, polygamy was used as a kind of slippery slope argument against same-sex marriage equality. Conservatives and opponents of same-sex marriage would say, well, if you're going to allow 2 men or 2 women to marry, then you have to allow group marriage to happen. For that reason, I think a lot of people, and naturally I understand why, became very sensitive to the perception that being in favor of same-sex marriage meant that you were necessarily in favor of polygamy. But I think you can probably detect that that's not a very valid reason to oppose group marriage rights. It's a matter of being caught in a particular political moment where that kind of association was inconvenient. Now that the gay marriage fight has been won, I think it's time to move on from that sort of short-term political need and focus on why we might want group marriage to be legal and what the actual moral and practical considerations are.
FREDDIE, let me ask you though, why would some who fought for gay marriage be opposed then to group marriages?
Well, that's a good question. You'd have to ask them. I mean, one of the things that's been remarkable about my piece is that although I've gotten both positive and negative responses, the negative responses have been dominated by irrationalism, by annoyance, by arguments to incredulity, by arguments to assertion. Like a lot of social changes, the notion of legalized polygamy tends to bring out a kind of emotionalism in people and not rational disagreement. So you'd have to ask them why.
Okay, well, let me ask Stephen this question. Your response to what FREDDIE is saying, and also does the same-sex ruling that we recently saw over in the United States now set a precedent for a ruling on polygamy, Stephen?
Yeah, I don't think it does. And the reason is that same-sex marriage is an extension of the Constitution's core guarantees of liberty and equality for all. Polygamy, in contrast, in practice, throughout human history and around the world now, has shown itself to be inconsistent with equality within marriage and inconsistent with the equal opportunity to marry in society. It's been associated very strongly throughout human history with patriarchy, with inequality in the family, with higher rates of violence in the family and in society. So in fact, they raise very different sets of issues. And historically, same-sex marriage makes sense after we have spousal equality in marriage, so after the women's movement, after the establishment of equality in marriage. Polygamy, on the other hand, is a very old form of marriage that's hyper-traditional. It's a form of marriage that existed in the past almost everywhere. And it went along with patriarchal arrangements, as I say, in society and in the family. And so that's the practice. So the fact is, and I agree with Frederick that we haven't had enough discussion of this, that polygamy raises very serious concerns from those core constitutional commitments to freedom and equality that same-sex marriage does not raise.
Andy, Stephen talking about some of the challenges that are faced when it comes to polygamy, but focusing a little from what I detect on the sort of constitutional rights as well as social issues. But you have a legal background. What sort of legal challenges are there when it comes to polygamy?
Well, I think the important thing to understand is that the progress around same-sex marriage did not occur because there was suddenly a cogent legal argument for same-sex marriage where there previously had not been. The success of the movement came because of a cultural shift. And so the question of whether or not there is a cogent legal argument for group marriage or multi-marriage arising out of this ruling is an interesting theoretical one, but it's not actually the same question of is the United States actually going to legalize group marriage anytime soon? That's more of a cultural question.
Okay.
I do think that
right, go on.
we have precedent. You know, I think the question of how this would be implemented is one that seems to be weighing on a lot of people's minds. People saying, oh, we'd have to totally reconfigure how we deal with healthcare, how we deal with immigration, you know, all of that.
Are these valid points that people are putting forward, Andy?
Yes and no. On one hand, we already have legal precedent for structures through which more than two individuals can share things like health insurance and own property together. It's called an LLC. That already exists. And so a lot of the stuff that people are saying we would have to reinvent the wheel on, I don't think we actually would. And further, I think that a lot of the things that people are worried about reinventing actually really should be reinvented. I mean, saying that we'd have to figure out how to do things like health insurance all over again if group marriage became legal, and that would be a bad thing, presupposes that our current system of health insurance in the United States is flawless, which it absolutely is not. And so, you know, I think it's a good question of what is the best way to move forward with health insurance in America. I don't think the way we've been doing it is right. I don't know that continuing to allow it to be predicated on whether or not you're in one specific type of sexual or romantic relationship, whether that's the measure of whether or not you deserve health care. I don't know that that's the right way to go forward either. But the idea that the way that we're doing health insurance now or the way that we're doing immigration now is great and shouldn't be changed is ridiculous.
Freddie, I see you nodding to what Andy is saying, but let me ask you about this. I mean, there just doesn't seem to be an existing template when it comes to multiple marriages and polygamy. So the government, in a way, will have to rewrite the rules of marital relationships, will they not?
Well, to begin with, part of the point of all this is that I don't think that the government has any business sort of regulating what kind of consenting adult loving relationships it should be formally sanctioning. The government, in my opinion, should only be interested in relationships to the degree that it prevents threats, the use of force or coercion in their formation. It's true that there are some logistical hurdles to get through, but I think we have a long precedent of saying in this country that rights should not be determined by whether they are convenient. I use the analogy of the Americans with Disabilities Act. If you look at the Americans with Disabilities Act over its history, it's been one of the most expensive pieces of legislation in history because it's caused hundreds of millions of dollars in infrastructural changes to places in order to make them accessible to the disabled. But despite that cost, it's one of the best pieces of legislation in our country's history because logistics are not a legitimate reason to deny people rights.
But you can't deny that logistics do exist, though. You can't deny logistics do exist. There are issues that will arise when it comes to parenting, when it comes to spousal support, when it comes to alimony, when it comes to health insurance, which we've already spoken about.
Well, but let's compare that to traditional monogamous marriage. Are there problems with alimony, with spousal support, with child custody, things like that? In fact, we have an enormous child court system. We have an enormous divorce court system. Despite the fact that we've had those things traditionally, we spend a ton of money legislating these battles. They're extraordinarily bitter. The fact that we have those sort of traditional structures hasn't prevented those legal problems. A monogamous marriage has no business telling people in polyamorous relationships that it's too inconvenient for them because, frankly, the legal structure of marriage right now is very expensive and legally onerous.
Stephen, it does seem that support for polygamy is rising. Yeah. Yes, you can. I'll ask you to respond to what Freddie was saying, but also support is rising. According to a Gallup poll, I mentioned it a few moments ago, it's increased from 5% in 2006, to 16% today. So support is on the rise.
Yeah, I think you said 16, which is still a rather small number. And as we discuss this more and learn more about it, I'm pretty confident it won't go to anything like a majority. The one thing I would say is that
how can you say you're pretty confident? How do you know that?
Seems to me an argument. Well, I think there are good reasons to not go there. I'm not going to try to predict public opinion, but I can say a few things about what we ought to do, and I hope that public opinion comes around that way given what we know. I mean, the one thing I would say is that Frederick's argument seemed to be that the government should not be in the business of defining how many people we can love. Well, that's not, in that case, you should be against the institution of marriage in a sense. Through marriage is a social institution by which we recognize a particular form of commitment between two people that has proven itself to be good for those people, good for their children, and good for society. And it's a form that very many people in our society want to enter into. Now, it's a separate question of what people should be permitted to do and should be free to do without being subject to the criminal law. So I agree that the government should not be interfering with people's private choices so long as they're not harmful. But the whole point of marriage as a social institution, as something that's established by law, is to recognize that there's a certain general pattern of commitment between two people that has proven itself to be successful. And if we compare the evidence for monogamy with the evidence for polygamy throughout human history and around the world today, we see very different patterns. We see much higher rates of violence, much higher rates of conflict. Even the defenders of polygamy admit that there are special problems of jealousy in multi-party relationships, jealousy among the wives, jealousy among the children, constant worries about favoritism, and so on. The fact is that many Mormons who defended polygamy within the Mormon Church have said that they didn't think it should be extended to the wider society because polygamy requires special virtue. It was limited to the Mormon elect.
All right, let's bring Freddie in. Let's bring Freddie in to respond. And then, Andy, I will come over to you in just 1 second. Freddie, go ahead.
So first of all, I fully acknowledge that if you look at the tradition of polygamy as it's been practiced, that there have been problems with things like sort of lack of gender balance. I completely disagree with you when you suggest that traditional two-person marriage is in contrast to that. If you go out across the world today and you actually take a close look at the gender relationships in traditional marriages, I promise you that the amount of marriages where there's true gender equity will be a rounding error. Traditional marriage has always been a form of patriarchal control. Yes. The notion that somehow we've reached this sort of husband-dominated world in traditional marriage, I think is just not true. More importantly, the fact of polygamy's taboo and illegality causes you to say that this structure is inherently produces unstable relationships because it pushes the practice of polygamy into the niches of society. So I am constantly debating with people who, for example, talk to me about conditions in Senegal, which I think we'd all agree is not an analog to a liberal democracy like ours, or they talk about people who live in fringe religious communities. Well, it's the very fact of the matter that people who only pursue polygamy because of its illegality if they're on the fringes of society. The fact of the matter is we don't know what polygamy would be like in a liberal progressive democracy where people from outside of the fringes were able to take advantage of it. And more importantly, that's not how rights work. We don't distribute rights by saying, okay, I've looked at this group and I've looked at that group, and you know, these sort of relationships over here don't seem to go as well, so we're not going to give it to you.
Speaking of rights,
if we had evidence that interracial marriage had poor outcomes, if we had evidence that same-sex marriage had poor outcomes in the way you're talking about, would that really be a reason to forbid those marriages?
Okay, hang on one second. Andy, Freddie was just talking about rights. If gay marriage is now a constitutional right, why, in your opinion, is polygamy not?
I think Freddie makes a good point that whether or not something is a good idea and whether or not it's protected by the Constitution are not exactly the same question. I mean, the other gentleman whose name I didn't catch, I'm sorry.
Stephen.
You said that, Stephen, thank you. Stephen said that throughout history, polygamous families have been subject to higher rates of violence. Well, statistically, heterosexual couples are subject to higher rates of violence than homosexual ones. So by your logic, we should be outlawing straight marriage. So I think whether or not there's a constitutional right to polygamous marriage, as I said, I'm not sure that's really the right question to be asking. You know,
so where do you think the debate? Where do you think the debate? Andy, let me just stick with you for 1 second, and Stephen, I'll give you a chance to respond. Andy, if that's not the right question, sure, where should the debate now in the United States be going?
Well, so here's the thing that I see as the real impediment to a useful debate about this, which is that we as a culture, and even in the context of this interview, I see we're not pulling on two ends of the same rope here. We're really conflating two kinds of relationships. We're talking about polygamy, which has all of these connotations of religious orthodoxy and of being sort of the literal embodiment of patriarchy, of of being this very fringe, very sort of culty or Mormon exclusive thing. And then we have other types of ethical non-monogamy, which is what's practiced by the people that I work with in my firm, where you've got people who are feminists, who are committed to gender equity in their relationships, and who, as an expression of their progressive politic around the way that they choose to structure their life and their family with intentionality, reject a monogamous model. And clearly those two things are very, very different. And we're talking about them as if they're identical. And so what
Andy,
I hear
allow
you
me
saying,
to just
Stephen,
correct you for a moment, because in no way during the course of this interview have we portrayed this as culty, as you refer to. We're just trying to ask the right questions here and talk about the legal challenges as well as the social challenges that face this issue. And it's a debate that's going on in the United States. But please do go on.
Absolutely. I'm talking about the debate as it's framed generally. We have this cultural narrative. People in the United States hear the word polygamy and they think sister wives, when in fact there's a much broader range of what it means to be in more than one consensual adult romantic relationship than just that model. And I think if we're going to actually have a coherent conversation about whether or not there should be legal protections for group marriage, we're going to need to separate those two things out and get a coherent narrative about what we're talking about. Because the clients that I work with in my practice, they are in consensual adult non-monogamous relationships, whether that's 3 people who are committed to each other, whether that's a more complex network of different types of relationships, whether it's 2 couples who live together and raise children together. it's a general understanding that there are more ways to have a family than just a married heterosexual mom and dad and biological children and a white picket fence in the suburbs.
Okay.
That there are more options than that.
Stephen,
and so the legal
what
protections
benefits
that
could there, I apologize, Andy, but let me just cross over to Stephen. What benefits could there be from recognizing polygamous relationships?
Yeah, look, I'm in favor of recognizing healthy relationships that people want to enter into that are good for them in various ways. At the moment, given what we know, it seems to me it would be a big mistake to extend equal recognition to plural marriages in the same way that we do to monogamous ones.
Why would it be a
Some
mistake?
things have been said about monogamous marriage being still traditional. Well, because let me just say one thing about monogamous marriage at the moment. People entering into it under favorable circumstances in the United States, that is, take a married couple with both of whom have college degrees, those marriages are very equal, not completely equal, not as equal as they should be. They still follow traditional gender roles to some extent, but they're much more equal than they have been, and they're very successful, remain stable, and those parents they're great parents and so on. We have no comparable knowledge, no social knowledge at all of these polyamorous relationships, which do exist in some numbers, some scattering. There's not a single systematic study. There's no broad social movement, anything equivalent to the broad social movement for same-sex rights that went on for decades. We really don't know a lot about these polyamorous relationships. Now, it's true that we should protect them, we should extend rights in sensible ways, but it would be a big mistake, I think, to simply create plural marriages, because actually the two gentlemen on the panel with me here are not defending polygamy in its traditional form. And we know there are many people out there that do wish to engage in polygamy in its traditional patriarchal form. Even in the sister wives family, which is very positive in all sorts of ways, and in many ways the best case. I mean, they're on television every week, so they're bound to present a very good case for it. It's still the traditional patriarchal form, and it's not a form that could be secured for all but a small elite of wealthy, high-status males. One of the things that polygamy in that sort of form accomplishes is far more unmarried males in society who are denied a fair opportunity to pursue the great good of family life. And that's one of the ways in which traditional polygamy is highly unequal. Okay. But certainly the law should recognize that a third parent or have parental rights being extended to more than two, hospital visitation rights, and so on. We should incrementally adjust our law to the valuable relationships that people choose, and some of those are going to involve more than a monogamous couple, of course.
Freddie, your response?
But
that doesn't mean that we create polygamy.
I joined Stephen in not having any interest in finding distasteful traditional religious sort of polygamy relationships. However, I think it's essential to say, as he just said, those relationships already exist. I mean, part of the difficulty for polygamy opponents is unless you are really opposed to it in the sense that you want to use the force of the government to prevent polyamorous groupings, then all we're doing by preventing the legal structure of marriage is we're not getting rid of the problems that he's associating with these groupings. We're just not giving formal legal protection to the people within them. There are thousands of people right now in America who are in what they call polygamous relationships, even though their marriages aren't recognized by the state. Like Stephen, I find lots of aspects of those relationships distasteful. But the fact is, they exist already, and nobody is in the business, nobody wants the government to get into the business of breaking them up. So what you are left with is you have all the problems that Stephen identifies, but then you also have these wives, generally wives, who don't have any formal legal protection in the case of the death of the husband. So they don't have any access to inheritance, they don't have any legal claim to the children. Now, obviously, I'm not, as an atheist, interested in propping up these sort of religious sects. But I do think that just as Stephen is saying we need to continue to reform monogamous relationships, I want to contribute to a reform of polygamous relationships. I think that feminist progress is going to continue to happen in this country. We're going to see more and more women who have the kind of social and economic power that has traditionally been reserved to men. And as that happens, you'll see more and more structures. You'll see structures like one woman with multiple husbands. You'll see 3 or 4 husbands, 4 or 5 wives. We need to continue to reform the underlying social problems that contribute to the problem Stephen is saying.
Okay.
I would say that the problems that he's identifying are problems with sexism rather than with polygamy as such.
On that note, I'll have to end it there, but this is a debate that's likely to go on and on over in the United States. But thank you very much to my guests for joining us on Inside Story, Freddie DEBOER, Stephen Macedo, and Andy Eisenson. Thank you very much. And thanks for watching the show. As always, we welcome your thoughts. You can get in touch through our program page on aljazeera.com. You can post your comments on facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also tweet us using @AJ Inside Story. From me and the whole team here in Doha, bye-bye for now.